Olá, olá, bom dia a todas, todos e todes. Que felicidade estar aqui com vocês hoje, estar reunindo, vendo rostos assim de amigos, parceiros. Muito bacana, obrigada a todo mundo por estar aqui na quarta edição da Negociando o Futuro, que esse ano a gente chamou de Financiando o Futuro, como vocês devem ter reparado nos nossos materiais dado o foco, né, desse ano que a gente resolveu fazer realmente uma conversa sobre o tema que vai dominar a COP desse ano e que também é né, o ponto-chave ali, acho que a gente ano passado chamou de a treta das tretas, a mãe de todas as tretas, porque realmente as ações climáticas, né, a implementação do Acordo de Paris depende do financiamento climático e das resoluções que vão ser tomadas esse ano, espera-se. E aí isso me dá o gancho perfeito para falar da primeira fala que a gente vai ter aqui, porque a Mariana Belmont mandou um áudio e eu acho que a gente já compartilhou nessa comunidade. Se vocês não fazem parte ainda, peço que entrem, porque é um recurso muito bacana. E ela falou um pouquinho, né, de como que essa herança colonial, que é tão forte no Brasil, no mundo, mas que para a gente é especialmente forte, como isso está na base da crise climática que a gente vive, né, como que a causa do problema também passa pela questão da colonização, e como que isso continua se reproduzindo no financiamento, como que a gente realmente precisa quebrar esse ciclo. E isso traz o link perfeito. Eu queria agradecer a Mariana por ter compartilhado com a gente esse áudio para a fala do professor Fadel, porque realmente ele é uma autoridade no assunto. O Fadel, ele é presidente do Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity, ele é membro do Independent Expert Group on Just Transition and Development e Senior Advisor do PowerShift Africa. E ele tem essa fala super interessante sobre o que as crises, né? Como a gente vai descolonizar para descarbonizar, o que a gente pode entender de conexão entre as diferentes crises que a gente vê acontecendo pelo mundo, os bancos multilaterais e o que isso tem a ver com os protestos e também com o financiamento climático. Ele é economista tunisiano e vai trazer para a gente realmente o que essa alma colonialista do capitalismo tem a ver com a crise que a gente enfrenta. Eu queria agradecer muitíssimo, professor Fadel. Com isso, eu passo a palavra e agradeço muitíssimo você estar aqui com a gente, Fadel.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you again for the kind invitation and for hosting this important conversation ahead of COP. So, what I wanted to talk about today is this idea of decolonizing in order to decarbonize. And the idea here is that when we talk about a just transition, we can't have a just transition under colonial economic architecture. So the economic imperative of a just transition is really to do the simultaneous decolonization of economic structures in the global South. And I'll focus my presentation today based on this report that some of you have seen, the Just Transition report, which was published by the Independent Expert Group on Just Transition and Development, which was convened by Dr. Yuba Sakona, who at the time was the vice chair of the IPCC. And this is available on our website, both in English and in French. And soon there will be a Spanish translation of the report. And what we try to do in this report is to put forward an African vision for a coherent, comprehensive, long-term, transformative framework that will simultaneously address climate, energy, and development issues, as opposed to these major issues being addressed in a siloed approach, which is the traditional approach in the policy space that these questions are usually addressed. And we wrote this from an African perspective, but it's really a global South perspective because this was very well received across the global South in Latin America and Asia Pacific region. And it's precisely because we in the global South have very similar economic structures, colonial structures that persist to this day. And I'll highlight this by starting with one important message that we tried to convey that really motivated this report to begin with, which is if we as Africans, if we as countries of the global south, if we don't have a long-term strategic vision for ourselves, I guarantee you we are already part of somebody else's strategic vision. And for a long time, the dominant economic blocs, whether it's the US or Europe or China now, and other major economic players, they all have a vision for the global south. They all have a plan for the global south. And it's not new. It started with the colonial vision, the colonial role that was imposed on Africa and on the rest of the global south. And this role can be summarized in three major points. Number one, we're supposed to be the place for cheap raw materials for the industrialized world. And we still play that role today. That's the colonial role that was imposed on us. Number two, we're supposed to be the consumers of industrial output and technology from the industrialized world. And again, we still play that role today. And number three, and most importantly, we're supposed to be the place where obsolete technologies, assembly line manufacturing that is no longer needed in the industrialized world is outsourced to us under the label of development and cooperation and job creation and technical assistance and all of that. But effectively, what this does is that it permanently locks us at the bottom of the hierarchy, at the bottom of the global value chain. And we still play that role today. So that's why we say that this colonial architecture was not designed for development. It was not designed for a just transition. It was not designed for the sustainable development goals. So why do we expect a colonial architecture that is by design extractive, abusive, violent, hierarchical to produce a just transition? How do we expect this colonial architecture to produce the SDGs? Of course, the SDGs are not achievable under this framework, and a just transition is not achievable under this architecture. And that's why we say we cannot decarbonize a system that hasn't been structurally and economically decolonized yet. Similarly, colonial architecture was not democratic and is not supposed to produce democratic results to meet the needs and aspirations of the people. So that's why we say we can't democratize a system that is still economically steered from abroad, that is still structurally colonized. And since you're in Brazil, and there's a lot of discussion in Brazil and across the global south about de-dollarization, we cannot de-dollarize an international system that's still structurally colonized. So with that in mind, let me start with zooming in on some of the key structural deficiencies that we struggle with in the global south that must be addressed as part of the process of decolonization in order for us to have a true just transition and decarbonization in the global south. So, of course, everybody's familiar with the problem of external debt, not so much in Brazil these days, but it's still the legacy of the debt crisis in Brazil is still alive and well, at least in the psyche of Brazilian policymakers. But it's a serious problem across the global south. I'm in Kenya now, and Kenya today spends 50% of its export revenues go towards debt service, paying interest on the debt. So, of course, external debt eliminates the fiscal policy space that our countries need to invest in health, in education, and climate adaptation, and everything else, all the other major priorities. So, external debt is a big problem, but it's actually a symptom of deeper structural issues that can be summarized in three major points. Number one, energy deficits. Number two, food deficits. And number three, low value-added manufacturing, that is manufacturing value-added deficits. And I'll explain each very briefly. So when I say energy deficits in the context of the global south, the African continent in particular, our largest oil exporter in Africa is Nigeria. Nigeria today imports 100% of its gasoline from international markets. The second largest exporter, Angola, imports 80% of its fuel from international markets. And the list goes on, which means that this is not by accident. This is by design. This is the classic fossil fuel industry economic entrapment for the countries that are rich in natural resources in general, including fossil fuels. And in the old energy system that we're trying to exit from, the fossil fuel energy system, we've always been denied access to technology for looking for fossil fuels, for drilling for fossil fuels, and for refining fossil fuels. And as we transition to the new energy system, we already see the fact that we're again denied access to the technology to actually manufacture and deploy the renewable energy infrastructure. We're only allowed to import it from major producers. And number two, when we talk about food deficits in Africa, today Africa imports 85% of its food from outside the continent, when less than 100 years ago, we used to be the breadbasket for colonial powers. And that didn't happen by accident, it's by design, because as soon as we started to gain independence in the mid-1950s, the global north reorganized the global food system with heavy agricultural subsidies to producers in Europe, the US, Canada, Australia, and beyond, and of course the former Soviet Union, which is why Russia and the Ukraine dominate the industry, with other global south comers that came later, of course, like Brazil, Argentina, Indonesia, and so on. But it's the global food system is dominated by a handful of countries that produce the core crops, that is wheat, corn, rice, soybean, and so on. And that forced farmers in the rest of the global south, in Africa in particular, to move away from producing those crops because you can't compete with the cheaper subsidized grain coming from the global north. And we had to specialize in producing coffee, tea, tobacco, and fruits and complementary food items. So today we have a food system where we consume what we don't produce and we produce what we don't consume. And that is a structural trap. And that is a major source of external borrowing in the global south. And finally, number three, and most importantly, the kind of manufacturing base that we were allowed to have in the global south, and I use the term very carefully, allowed to have, is the kind where you have to import the machines, import the intermediate components to be assembled with low-cost labor, import the fuel to power the factories, and we even import the packaging. So we end up with a manufacturing base that produces low value-added content for exports, and what we import is high value-added content. So you can double, triple, or even quadruple your export with free trade agreements. You're always locked at the bottom of the global value chain. So you take these three structural deficits, food, energy, and manufacturing, which are fundamental for any economy, and you have a structural trade deficit year after year, decade after decade, which leads to currency depreciation. When you have a trade deficit, your currency becomes weaker relative to the dollar, relative to the euro. And of course, with the weaker currency, anything you need to import the next morning, whether it's food or fuel or medicine, you import it at a higher price because your currency is weak. So we literally import inflation in the most sensitive areas of the economy, affecting the most vulnerable people. So that puts our governments immediately in a defensive position to protect the most vulnerable. So what we do is we subsidize food, we subsidize fuel, we subsidize medicine as much as possible, but that becomes unsustainable to do this for 60, 70, or 80 years. So now that you're in this trap, the government immediately starts to ask the central bank to do its best to fight and defend the exchange rate, stabilize the exchange rate. And central banks do it with the Band-Aid solution. And the way they do it is by borrowing more dollars and feeding the external debt trap. And when you have unsustainably high levels of debt, all of your economic priorities are rearranged to prioritize any economic activity that will allow you to earn dollars to service the debt. So the extractive industry thrives in this situation because all the international extractive companies, extractive, whether it's of resources or labor, they come and abuse the system because you're desperate for dollars. And that is the root cause of the external indebtedness that eliminates the fiscal policy space. And that needs to change because this is not sustainable. Let me show you some of the numbers. If we take this on a global scale, if you divide the world between global north and global south, and you net out all global financial transactions, you get that green line, which I will explain very briefly. That is, if you track exports, imports, foreign direct investment, remittances from workers, even illicit financial flows, all financial transactions, the net amount, the last data point we have is $2 trillion moving from the global south to the global north. That's money moving in the wrong direction. So this is what we call the global economic architecture that was not designed by us, not designed for us. It was designed for colonial extractive purposes, and it's producing exactly the extraction of wealth that you see on display here. So notice that green line has been accelerating over the last 20 and 30 years, which means if we don't do anything about this colonial economic architecture, we will see an acceleration beyond the 2 trillion that you see here. And when I say global economic architecture, it means 4 basic pillars. It's the financial architecture, that's the World Bank and IMF. It's the trade and investment architecture, that's the WTO, the World Trade Organization. And it's the international taxation architecture, which for the longest time was in the hands of the OECD countries. And finally, last November, thanks to the Africa Group and a bloc of Latin American countries led by Colombia and Brazil, we managed to organize a large bloc of G77 countries to finally take the international tax system from the hands of the OECD and into the UN system with one country, one vote. And that's the UN Tax Convention framework that is being established as we speak. So that's the process of decolonizing international taxation. We still need to decolonize the IMF and the World Bank, which is almost impossible with US veto power, which means we have to build an alternative architecture. The IMF and World Bank are not reformable in a structural way under the current geopolitical setting. And of course, the WTO tends to be the biggest blind spot that is often neglected in these conversations. And the rules of investment in international trade, that's also a process that must happen in order for us to truly transform the system. So here's a summary of where climate finance is today. You have $2 trillion moving in the wrong direction from the global south to the global north. Next to it, as you can see, there's that $100 billion that was promised more than 15 years ago and not delivered. And whatever was delivered was loans, non-concessional loans for economic entrapment. Next to it, you have the Green Climate Fund, which if you look at their website today, I think the number is about $12 billion in the Green Climate Fund. And then that tiny little dot on the left-hand side of the screen, that's the Loss and Damage Fund that was created last year at COP28, and it's $700 million. So this is the reality of climate finance. And I always ask people if they can find a single climate fund, global or regional climate fund, that can match the annual profits of the 4 big extractive, fossil fuel companies operating at least on the African continent. So this is the picture I always say, take a screenshot or take a selfie with and send it to your climate negotiators before they go to COP, because this is what climate finance looks like today. And this is not the way to a just transition. So zooming in on some of the data that I mentioned earlier, looking at the African continent as a whole, you can eyeball the problem here. This is the volume of Africa's exports is 692 billion. Notice the volume of Africa's imports is 791. So we have a structural trade deficit on a continental scale. And then look at the composition of our exports. It's raw materials, it's crude oil, it's low value added manufacturing, and it's cash crops. Cocoa and flowers and cut flowers, that is, and complementary food items, not core food items. Now look at Africa's imports. The core food items are imported. That's wheat, that's corn, that's rice. And then we import refined petrochemicals and high value added manufactured products and pharmaceuticals. So it's the 3 structural deficiencies that I described on a continental scale. And then zooming in on one example, I could have picked any other country, but this one example, Kenya. You look at Kenya's exports, it's $12 billion, and you can see the composition. It's tea, it's coffee, it's cut flowers, and low value added manufacturing. And then you look at Kenya's imports, it's refined petroleum products, it's rice, it's wheat, it's pharmaceuticals, and it's the high value added manufacturing. And notice the imports are 25 billion, the exports are 12 billion. So that produces this kind of pressure on the value of the Kenyan shilling, on the exchange rate. And the line, when the line is going up, that's the dollar becoming stronger and stronger relative to the Kenyan shilling. And as you can see, this is not related to COVID. This is not related to the crisis in the Ukraine or any particular president or prime minister. This is structural. Country after country after country, you can see the same pressure on the exchange rate. And the flip side of it is the exponential increase in external debt, in external borrowing. Country after country after country, this is a structural issue. This is not related to any particular. Of course, COVID matters. Of course, the Ukraine disruption and conflict matters. Of course, presidents and prime ministers matter. But this is beyond any particular individual crisis. So the structural solutions that we must unite behind happen to be, as you'll see in the next minute, happen to be both structural solutions that address the root causes in colonial structures, but all of the structural solutions happen to be climate action solutions. So it's a win-win on both fronts. And that's why we call for Pan-African and Global South cooperation for strategic investments in these three core categories. Number one, food sovereignty and agroecology, not just food security, because food security is a dangerous colonial term, technical term that means you secure the nutrition of your people, either by producing it or by importing it or by borrowing money to import it or by receiving it as food aid, which means you end up in a debt crisis. So we call for food sovereignty. Number two, renewable energy sovereignty, which, as I will show you in the next slide, is Africa and the rest of the global south biggest potential is in renewables, and prioritizing renewable energy production for the 650 million people on this continent who have no access to electricity today, rather than what is happening, which is producing renewable energy to export for Europe's energy security. And that's a serious problem we have today. And then finally, high value added industrial policies that focus on three industrial priorities. Number one, manufacturing the renewable energy infrastructure. This is real industrialization, high value added industrialization, using the strategic minerals that we have on this continent, using the labor force that we have the youngest labor force on the planet, and using the complementarity of resources and capabilities and the potential that we have. And then number two, clean cooking infrastructure for the 950 million people, mostly women and children on this continent, who are inhaling toxic fumes on a daily basis because of lack of clean cooking infrastructure. And of course, green public transportation infrastructure to interconnect our cities and our countries. Just these three industrial policies will completely decolonize and transform our economic system. But again, you look at this whole list: food sovereignty, energy, and green industrialization. This is all climate compatible green climate adaptation strategies. So it's a no-brainer. It's a win-win. And then, of course, as I mentioned earlier, none of this is possible under the global economic architecture. So it's about transforming, not just reforming, the financial architecture, the trade and investment and taxation architecture. And when it comes to the mainstream climate finance that you see, especially being pushed from the global north and unfortunately accepted or not challenged very much yet by the global south, we see no argument for reparations, for climate reparations, and no grants. All we see is market-based greenwash solutions. We see concessional loans and some non-concessional loans. We see a push for de-risking for foreign investors, which means foreign investors want you to guarantee that their extractive activity, their greenwashed activity, is actually guarantees a profit margin for them. That's what de-risking means. We see a push for pollution permits, or as they call them, carbon credits or carbon markets, which are false solutions, and I'm happy to elaborate on this during the Q&A. We see this call for green, quote-unquote, industrialization, but it's really assembly line manufacturing using green electricity produced in the global south that is designed to lock us at the bottom of the value chain. And whatever is manufactured is not the building blocks of the development and prosperity in the global south, but rather products that are destined to feed global north markets with more consumerism in energy waste. So we see energy extractivism, we see this decarbonization by dispossession, especially on the African continent, and to some extent now happening also in Latin America and other places. So this is what we want to expose moving into COP29 and hopefully COP30 in Brazil. We want to up the pressure on the climate finance front, and we want to reframe what climate finance should look like. So here's how climate finance, this is the easiest way I can explain how climate finance works today. From a global South perspective, we have a very simple understanding of this, that some countries have exceeded their carbon budget, that's the global north, and therefore they're in deficit, and they're appropriating the atmospheric space that is allocated to the global south. So what they owe is a climate debt, and we can quantify the climate debt, and I can show you the numbers in the next couple of slides. So when you owe a debt, you're supposed to pay the debt. I don't think that's a complicated concept. So imagine if I owe you $100. I must pay you $100. Nobody will disagree with this very simple principle, except in the climate finance space, this is how it works. Instead of me giving you $100, I'm going to give you $3, and I tell you exactly what to do with those $3. Make sure you stay at the bottom of the hierarchy. And then I say, well, clearly you need more climate finance than the $3. So I'm going to give you $7, lend you $7 at concessional rates, noblesse oblige. And tell you exactly what to do with the $7 and ask that you show me reports and KPIs and performance indicators to make sure that you're doing exactly what I'm telling you to do. And then I give you another $10, but you have to give me your forest for pollution permits. Yeah, you know what I mean? And then I say, well, I'm going to invest $8 in your economy, but you really have to de-risk my investment to produce green hydrogen for my economy, not for your economy. And then I invest another $12, but you have to become my CBAM partner. CBAM is the carbon border adjustment mechanism that Europe has introduced, and now the US, the UK, Canada, and Japan are considering introducing their own CBAM regulation. What CBAM does, it's a carbon border tax, essentially. So if you become my CBAM partner and allow me to invest in a green industrial zone in your country, like the green industrial zone in Namibia, to do assembly line manufacturing with green electricity, not for you, but for my industrial zone, then we can ship that the consumer products back to the EU market without paying the CBAM tax. So CBAM is a trade weapon against the EU's competitors, and it's an inflation management tool for the EU to allow their consumers to have cheaper products that are produced with cheaper electricity in Africa and cheaper labor in Africa. But effectively, it locks Namibia at the bottom of the global value chain, just like during colonial times. And just stay tuned for more innovation, for more market-based economic entrapment that is designed to greenwash, rinse, and repeat the same colonial hierarchy. And as I'm looking at this and I'm saying, this is what climate finance looks like, you're looking at me and saying, wait a minute, where's my $100? You're supposed to pay me $100. I'm not supposed to borrow from you. I'm not supposed to give you my forest. I'm not supposed to give you green hydrogen or anything. So this is what we need to expose in the climate finance space, that the terms of negotiations of what should be called climate finance should be based on the principle of the carbon budget, of the climate debt. And the idea of climate debt and climate reparation is that the North has exceeded its carbon budget. The North has appropriated the atmospheric commons. It has a climate debt owed to the global South. And we have study after study after study estimating the dollar amount. And this is one of the recent studies by Fanning and Hickel that estimates it at $193 trillion with a T, not billions, not millions. And here's this is just a screenshot from the paper showing basically which countries have exceeded their carbon budget, and you can clearly see which countries we're talking about versus which countries have not. And the rest of the global South, including China, by the way, including India, which are the sticky points in the negotiations, there's still countries that did not exceed their carbon budget. Yes, they're big emitters in recent years, but here we're talking about cumulative emissions since the Industrial Revolution. So that means the numbers essentially look like this. Even if you eliminate India, from the picture, even if you eliminate China from the picture, which is what the US and the global north want. They don't want to pay reparations to India and China. Sub-Saharan Africa alone, which is the poorest region on the planet and on the front lines of climate change, sub-Saharan Africa is owed $45 trillion. That's just this part of the continent, the southern part of the continent. And the rest of the global south, excluding Africa, China, and India, is owed $74 trillion. So this became the basis for this campaign that some of you have seen and participated in under the umbrella of CAN and other partner organizations, demanding $5 trillion per year, not as a full reparations, as a good faith down payment towards climate reparations. And you've seen the hashtag pay up. If you haven't seen it, just look it up on social media. And I hope that you will support the campaign to up the pressure moving towards New York Climate Week in a few days. And then, of course, COP29 and COP30. This should be the framing. And what the framing for climate finance would look like is the following. Number one, debt cancellation, not debt restructuring. And here, of course, there's a legitimate point to be made about debt cancellation outside of the climate space for, economic entrapment that happened outside the climate space. But you can argue that this is specific to the greenwashing debt entrapment that we've seen in the past and that we continue to see moving forward. So it's not restructuring and rescheduling, it's cancellation. Number two, grants, not loans, and further economic entrapment. And number three, transfer of life-saving technology to allow us to manufacture and deploy the building blocks of development and prosperity, the building blocks of climate adaptation, to manufacture and deploy renewable energy infrastructure, public transportation, and clean cooking infrastructure across the global south. And just to show you the immense potential that we have in the global south for renewable energy production, according to IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency, their last report about Africa, and I'm paraphrasing the language here, they summarize it by saying, by 2040, which is just in a few years, Africa can produce with existing renewables technology, not with new innovations. Africa can produce 1,000 times its anticipated energy needs and completely replace the entire exports of fossil fuels from the continent. 1,000 times. That's the potential that we have within the next 15 years. And yet, with all of this potential that is scientifically proving, Africa attracts less than 2% of financial flows that go towards renewables investments. And a lot of those investments are to extract and export to Europe rather than to serve the continent. So there's a reason for this puzzle, and I'm happy to go into it, that this is not by accident that we're not attracting the financing to deploy this infrastructure. And of course, the strategic minerals that we need for this green industrialization are abundant across the global south. As you can see, between Africa, Latin America, Asia Pacific region, the majority of these minerals are available. So what is stopping this unleashing of potential in terms of access to financing and access to technology, right? This is the technology that is systematically denied to us. And I can tell you why very briefly before I conclude. Imagine Africa's potential, put it side by side with OPEC, right? The organizations of petroleum exporting countries. Take OPEC and multiply its economic and geopolitical weight in the energy system, in the global system, multiply it by 1,000 times. That's Africa's potential. Africa alone, not the rest of the global south, which means this thing that we see as a massive potential for renewable energy and economic transformation is actually perceived by the global north as a threat, as a risk to be managed, to be minimized, to be eliminated. And that is the reality, which means transfer of technology and financing to unleash that potential will do the following. It will disrupt the existing colonial hierarchy that was not designed to be disrupted, because it will reposition the global south away from the bottom of the hierarchy. And that is not acceptable by the major economic blocs. And we have to be very realistic and serious about this. And I'm happy to explore this question during the Q&A. So the time to act is now. The polycrisis that we're dealing with requires urgent, bold, and radical action. And I use the term radical in the literal sense of the term, radical as in going to the roots of the problem. Because if I don't go to the roots of the problem for the structural transformation, then we're operating at the surface level. And surface level intervention is called superficial intervention. Superficial intervention don't transform anything. They reproduce the status quo. And here I want you to join me in being inspired by the words of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who in the context of the civil rights movement, because he was a radical, he was looking for transformative solutions. He said something, and I'm paraphrasing his language here. He said, "I have no time for the tranquilizing drugs of gradualism, incrementalism, false solutions, dangerous distractions." And this is precisely what we see in the climate finance space. We see tranquilizing drugs, incrementalism, false solutions, dangerous distractions that are designed not to disrupt the colonial hierarchy, the economic and geopolitical hierarchy. And that should be the starting point of our fight, of our struggle. And these mainstream climate finance solutions are too weak, too slow, too expensive, and that makes them dangerous socially, economically, politically, and ecologically, of course. And I truly believe that a realistic plan for structural transformation, for decolonization, cannot happen under the colonial economic architecture. So that's why we say we must decolonize the global economy. And some of you have seen the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty initiative, which really provides a framework for a just and equitable transition for the global South to negotiate on its own terms what this just transition and phasing out fossil fuels would look like. And I truly believe that a transformative Pan-African global South just transition framework is morally necessary, scientifically sound, ecologically mandatory, politically feasible, legally desirable, economically unavoidable, and financially affordable. Thank you very much. Obrigado.
Muito obrigada, professor Fadel. Assim, acho que o nosso objetivo de trazer você hoje como o nosso keynote speaker, assim, fazendo essa fala de abertura, cumpriu seu objetivo maravilhosamente bem, porque você realmente fez uma fala que abre a nossa cabeça para as causas do problema, né? Como que realmente essa arquitetura extrativista não pode apresentar as soluções, ela não vai nos levar para as soluções que a gente precisa, porque está na base da construção do sistema e que mudanças que a gente realmente precisa ver. Essa visão que você trouxe, né, ela vai dar o tom da nossa formação daqui para frente, então eu queria te agradecer muito por essa inspiração. Você tocou em vários pontos que a gente vai cobrir ao longo dos próximos dias, né? Então, você trouxe as bases da campanha do Pay Up, você falou também dessa dívida atmosférica, esses números. Então, esses assuntos a gente realmente vai cobrir nos próximos dias, a reforma das instituições financeiras. Espero que as pessoas peguem essa sua fala inicial e consigam olhar para esses problemas com essa lente e visão crítica que você trouxe para a gente. Então, acho que eu não consigo nem agradecer o suficiente. A gente sabe que a fala foi boa porque o chat está animadíssimo, com várias perguntas, provocações, pessoas já falando em protestos, então acho que você foi bem sucedido em trazer esse ânimo de realmente mudança radical que a gente precisa. A gente não tem tempo para pergunta, mas eu não vou conseguir deixar de aproveitar que você está aqui e aproveitar, porque eu vi pelo menos 2 vezes no chat as pessoas perguntando, mas como que a gente faz essa decolonização rápida, na velocidade que a gente precisa para lidar com a crise climática, né? Obviamente, você falou que não é só a crise climática, a gente também vai resolver o problema de desenvolvimento, mas é urgente. Como fazer isso de maneira rápida? Vou pedir para você ser o mais breve possível, mas agradecer imensamente pela sua participação. Obrigada.
Thank you so much. I'm glad this has been useful. So I'll go very directly to this. when we talk about that transformation and the need for debt cancellation, the need for grants, not loans, and further entrapment, and most importantly, transfer of technology, those are the big asks that are often, not often, always off the table when it comes to negotiations with the global north, whether it's on climate or debt or development or any question, because that will disrupt the hierarchy. Right. So how do we deal with this? And I joked when some of you and I met at the Cannes strategy meeting earlier this year, said we can go to COP and ask for even $10 of climate finance. We will not get it, right? Because we don't have any leverage, right? Whether it's 100 billion or 5 trillion or $5, we will not get it. So how do we force the transfer of technology? How do we force the different kind of a different terms of engagement? It has to be with the geopolitical leverage, with an actual threat. And today we don't represent any threat. There's a small window of opportunity that we have, not as individual countries, but as blocks of countries. So picture for a moment a block of global South countries. I'm just making this up. Say Brazil, South Africa, Kenya, Indonesia, Malaysia, with a handful of others, say 20 countries, right? Jointly designing an actual industrial policy to manufacture and deploy the, let's say, solar panels, the entire value chain of solar panels. We have the raw materials, we have the labor, we have a joint industrial policy. What we lack is the manufacturing capability, so transfer of technology. And I can tell you with 100% confidence today that transfer of technology for real industrialization will not come from the global north, because we know this from off-the-record conversations. You know, the gist of it is nobody in the global south is allowed to industrialize without our approval. I'm almost quoting verbatim off the record conversations. So, which means we have to figure out another strategy. It's not going to come from Europe. It's not going to come from the US. It's not going to come from any OECD country. That's the reality that we must accept. So imagine that block of countries go into a country like China, which has the entire value chain of manufacturing solar panels, and saying, look, we give you the bargain of the century. In 10 to 15 years, you double your industrial footprint globally. In 10 to 15 years, you double your geopolitical weight globally, and you secure your access to these precious minerals that everybody's panicking about. And we allow you to, you know, use the excess productive capacity and human engineering capacity, which is a problem internally for China today, to actually transfer technology as a partner, right, to manufacture and deploy and replicate the entire value chain in this block of countries. And this is extremely important because China will accept this bargain, will not have any other choice but to partner with the bloc of global south. Just triggering this process will give us the second bargaining chip that we need to change the terms of engagement with the global north. So now we can go to Germany or France and say, we give you the same bargain. If you transfer technology to manufacture and deploy wind turbine technology, high-speed rail technology, whatever technologies we need for building blocks of development and prosperity. If they say no, we OECD countries, we don't transfer technology, we don't partner like this, we only partner in colonial hierarchies, say, okay, you can keep your technology. China has wind turbine technology. China has high-speed rail technology. Now, good luck having access to strategic minerals. Good luck having access to the biggest market on the planet, which is the global south market, right? Of course, that will not happen. And the purpose of this strategy is not to position China at the top, but rather to change the terms of engagement with the rest of the world and to reposition the global south at the center of a new international economic order, as the arbiter of a new geopolitical and economic multipolar world. And that is our real opportunity and real potential, but it will not work unless that bloc is truly united and determined, because this is like walking into the lion's den. These geopolitical bargains, you get eaten alive if you're not ready. And that's something that many of my colleagues and I are working on, and we're hoping that Brazil would be one of the leading countries in this bloc to bring together a bloc of Latin American, African, Asia Pacific countries as an initial bloc, and then everybody else in the global south eventually will have to join that bloc because they have no other opportunity. And everybody in BRICS, the entire BRICS thinking will be rewired away from its current mercantilist vision of the world and into true global south partnership, geopolitical and economic transformation. So that's, in a nutshell, the only way. And once you have that, now you can impose debt cancellation. Now you can impose climate reparations. But today you have no leverage. You can say and present all the legal, moral, scientific arguments. You get nothing because you are not a threat, a real threat to the hierarchy.